Hello and welcome to another Making News. Now, Make UK has produced a report in association with Barclays Corporate that tackles one of the thorniest issues affecting logistics in the UK: how to get our manufactured goods where they need to be quicker and cheaper. I'm joined by Make UK senior economist Fhaheen. Fhaheen, what are the key infrastructure problems facing manufacturers that this report seeks to highlight and resolve?
So it's very interesting. I mean, I think it goes back to why we did this report in the first place. Last year, we surveyed our members, manufacturers across the UK, and asked them what they thought about the quality of our infrastructure, the things that we need for getting accessing jobs and moving goods across the country and overseas. And the consensus was pretty stark that the majority of manufacturers, over 90% of manufacturers, said that they felt that the quality of infrastructure had declined. To give the UK some credit, we've actually been really good with infrastructure for a very, very long time, but our assets are starting to age. And at what point does it become a problem is when our competitors, like in countries like in Germany and France, and then you look even further beyond places like Singapore and South Korea and the US, their investment in infrastructure is actually improving. And so now where it's about whether or not we are still competing at a global stage. And our members have told us the problem is that it's not that our infrastructure is bad, but actually we're not competing at the same level as other countries. So they're able to move their goods more efficiently, they're able to access labor more efficiently, and that puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Now, why we're talking about rail and highlighting the challenges, not just about what we can do with rail, but we're also at the 200th anniversary of the very first rail movement in the UK. And so, if there was any time to talk about the value and the history of how important rail is to the UK, now would be the moment. And that's what we've tried to highlight today, that it can help manufacturers actually do and run their businesses better.
I find it really interesting that 85% of those you spoke to are in support of resurrecting the original planned HS2 line to reach Leeds and Manchester. Now, what was the reasoning behind their answer?
So I think there's really two ideas rooted within the minds of manufacturers. The first one, it's about showing commitment to the rest of the world that the UK can actually take on and build important nationally significant infrastructure projects. When the HS2 second phase was cancelled, the reasoning behind that cancellation was absolutely sensible, but it sent the wrong message to the international community that when we have big ideas, we're not able to commit to them, and that has an effect on investment. And manufacturers want to see confidence. Now, the second thing is a little bit more practical. HS2's original purpose, which I think maybe some people have forgotten about, it was never about helping people get to Birmingham or Manchester 10 minutes faster, because I think that's one of the critiques, like, oh, it's only just a slight improvement on what we already have. It was about improving total capacity in the entire network. If we are able to move more people onto high speed rail, you free up capacity in all the old rail lines so businesses can use it to move goods services more frequently. Now, whilst we still have that in the south, businesses in the north have actually lost access to that with the cancellation of this project. So they still believe that there is a role to play for HS2, but we need to remember what it was really for. It wasn't for people moving. It does help that, but it was ultimately for businesses.
Now, we know HS2, the second phase, was cancelled because of, it was bedeviled. The whole thing's been bedeviled by cost and timetable overruns. How realistic, really, is it to hope for its full revival?
I think it's right that the reasons it was cancelled, originally it was projected to cost around 33 billion pounds, and then the projected costs ballooned to about 71 billion pounds. And before we were willing to pay that price, the government had to make that decision to exit. But where we can do things slightly differently now is that there has been work being done by the government. There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment known as the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which is actually making some significant changes. We've been trying to tackle planning issues for as long as I can remember in the UK. If you've ever heard the term NIMBYism, not in my backyard, there are often people who fight very hard against ensuring that they don't, they love to see infrastructure, just not in their own neighborhoods. And that is a massive problem. Now, that's not necessarily wrong, but there has to be certain situations where the benefit of the interests of an individual do not outweigh the interests of an entire nation. So the Planning and Infrastructure Bill will make a change that if there is a nationally significant infrastructure project like a HS2, then you can only challenge it one time if you want to appeal it. Currently, in the system, you can challenge it up to 3 times, which is vastly inefficient and actually has the opposite effect of delaying projects years and years ahead. Even if you were to win that case, you'd be so far behind in your projected timeline that you may never actually get to see the end of that light. So that change might actually make projects like HS2 more feasible to get it done now.
Now, obviously, if you speak to anybody about road congestion or anything, the first thing they're going to say is, why can't we get all these lorries off the roads and get that freight onto rails? But as far as manufacturers are concerned, I mean, they're only going to do that if it's convenient and cheap for them to actually access the rail terminals themselves so they can get their goods onto the trains. What does the report say about that?
Absolutely. The primary cause of concern or the barrier to accessing rail freight by manufacturers, more than half of manufacturers said that it was cost issues. And there was an interesting case study about Royal Mail, for example, in 2024. They dropped out of using rail freight entirely because of high electricity prices. They couldn't afford to actually pay for the use of rail freight trains, even though it was more efficient for moving goods, it was too costly. For manufacturers, especially if you're an organization much smaller than Royal Mail, you're going to struggle to pay the fees. The second thing is it's actually very complex to access rail freight. You can't, if you're a small business and you're making a small amount of stuff or you make very bespoke goods, you need to be able to afford to buy a rail freight carriage and be able to fill it to make most use out of it. And that doesn't really work at the moment. The third issue is the last mile challenge. Even if we fix this issue and make rail really, really easy to access, you're still going to need a lorry or a van to take those goods that you want to move across the country to a rail station. And that is often the challenge we find. Now, we do have some solutions to this in terms of other than the cost, which is, I think, the most difficult to challenge in terms of accessing for mixed volume manufacturers. We know that it is quite easy to, let's say, for me and you to buy a train ticket or a seat on a train. It's relatively a simple procedure. You buy a ticket, every seat is roughly the same, and you might apply a different value to whether it's next to a window or next to a socket, but it's pretty simple. In air freight systems, the aeroplane providers, they sell ticket prices, but a ticket for carriage by volume and weight. But the rail freight system has no such equivalent. So I think a digital solution that models a ticket-based solution, which makes it easier for businesses not to just fill an entire carriage, but to just buy a small amount of space on a carriage, can make it much more flexible and accessible for businesses to utilize rail freight in a way that is more efficient for their business. Now, long term, governments need to invest more in intermodal transportation. That is making sure that we don't just invest in rail, but making sure the road networks are also connected to rail in such a way that we can still use our HGVs. Maybe they don't travel as far as they used to, all the way from the north of England to the south, but they just need to be able to get to the local depot station to drop off those goods. And that can make a massive difference to access and make it really simple for businesses to use.
Well, the government is on record as saying it wants to grow rail freight by 75% by 2050. The recommendations in this report would seem to be extraordinarily helpful in helping make that happen. How confident are you that the government is going to listen?
I believe that the some of the low-hanging fruit suggestions, like using the adoption of digital technologies, the government will take an interest in those. Some of the other recommendations require a little bit more ambition, but that is something we are asking government to do. We want them to be ambitious about the UK's infrastructure because we are falling behind as a nation, and so we need to take big, bold steps. That target for 75% increase in volumes for rail freight by 2050 is achievable because we still have a high speed rail project in the south, but there is something still missing in the Midlands and North. And if we are going to actually be serious about this target, then we need to think of solutions for them too.